You've probably heard the term Dark Ages, right?
Mm.
It often makes us picture, 1,000 years of just intellectual glue. This long, empty stretch between ancient Rome and the bright dawn of the Renaissance.
Yeah, that image is really
But what if we told you that period was actually brimming with intellectual discovery, complex power struggles, and, well, truly surprising shifts in how people thought about love and intimacy?
That notion of an intellectual void is, frankly, a powerful misconception. Our deep dive today aims to look beyond that stereotype.
Right.
And reveal a medieval Europe that was incredibly dynamic, complex, and really foundational to our world.
Absolutely. So today we're diving deep into the medieval mind. We'll unpack how knowledge was preserved and expanded, how power was defined
And how desire, especially sexual desire, how that was understood and experienced.
Exactly. Our mission is to challenge those old ideas and show you just how vibrant and sometimes, contradictory this era truly was.
And to guide us through this really rich history, we've drawn extensively from conversations with Professor Robert Bartlett, who's a genuine authority in the field.
A real expert.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
He's illuminated a wealth of historical insights, and we're eager to share some real aha moments with you.
Yeah, this isn't just about, ancient history or dusty old texts. It's about understanding the deep foundations of so many of our modern instincts and beliefs.
It really is.
So let's unpack this together and discover a medieval world far richer than you might ever have imagined. Okay, let's start by tackling that notorious phrase, dark. It's tempting to think of the time after Rome's fall. A pause, maybe? But that's really not.
Not at all. I mean, while the very early parts of the Middle Ages, say immediately after Rome's collapse in the West, might feel dark, simply because we lack as many historical sources.
Right, a lack of data, essentially.
Exactly. But the whole era, roughly 500 to 1500 AD, was anything but ignorant. It was buzzing with activity.
So when we talk about medieval knowledge, what are we actually discussing? Was it only philosophical texts and religious doctrine?
Oh, far from it.
Yeah.
No, this wasn't just book learning, though. That was important. It included a huge amount of practical, technical knowledge, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about some of the later medieval periods, really game-changing inventions.
Yeah.
Windmills for grinding grain or draining land.
Oh, okay.
Sophisticated mechanical clocks that started to, structure daily life in a new way. And even spectacles. Eyeglasses for improving vision. These were tangible advancements.
Things that really impacted people's lives directly.
Absolutely. Real world impact.
And a critical constant influence throughout this whole 1,000 years was the Christian church's dominance over learning and education. How did it come to play such a central role, especially after Rome fell?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? The church essentially acted as what some call the ghost of the Roman Empire.
Huh. Interesting way to put it.
It inherited and preserved a vast amount from Rome. Latin, for instance, became the universal language of the church, the Bible, and pretty much all learning in Western Europe. That linguistic continuity was absolutely crucial in a fragmented world.
And they even preserved pagan Roman literature. Things like Virgil. That seems surprising, almost, taking insights from non-Christian sources.
Precisely. They had a strategy, sometimes called spoiling the Egyptians. It's a biblical reference.
Huh.
The idea was to extract useful insight, wisdom or rhetorical skill, from non-Christian sources while rejecting their religious beliefs. And the Carolingian period, the 9th century after Charlemagne.
Right, the Carolingian Renaissance.
Exactly. That was a crucial sort of bottleneck. Thousands of Latin manuscripts were meticulously copied by monks then, ensuring their survival. Without that massive effort, a lot of classical antiquity could have just vanished.
Wow. But the early medieval West still had pretty limited access to ancient Greek thought, right? The other pillar of class. Yeah. How did that knowledge finally make its way back?
That's where the Islamic world plays a truly crucial, absolutely central role.
How so?
Well, Greek knowledge was first translated into Syriac, then into Arabic. It was studied, developed, commented upon in the booming Abbasid Empire, think Baghdad.
Okay.
This immense reservoir of Greek science and philosophy was later translated, mostly in the 12th and 13th centuries, into Latin. And that's when it became widely available to Western European scholars. It was a massive intellectual transfer.
That sounds like a huge undertaking. Can you help us picture that? Where did this happen?
Absolutely. Think of multilingual cities, especially in Spain, like Toledo. These were vital translation centers.
Right, because you had communities living side by side.
Exactly. People there understood Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and the developing Romance language. You had individuals like Daniel O'Morley, an Englishman, who actually traveled internationally to Spain, specifically seeking out this new knowledge.
Imagine making that journey just for books.
It shows the hunger for it. But, this new knowledge wasn't always a smooth fit. Aristotle's philosophy, for instance, created some pretty significant intellectual challenges to biblical teachings, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Take cosmology. Aristotle's idea of an eternal universe clashed directly with the biblical account of creation from nothing.
Precise. This led to serious intellectual friction, intense debates among scholars. The University of Paris, which was becoming a major center of learning, even drew up a list of propositions derived from Aristotle, deemed to be errors. They were trying to reconcile these new insights with Christian dogma.
Always a tension there. And what about the Byzantine Empire? I mean, they still spoke Greek. How did they factor in?
That's a good point. The Byzantine Empire preserved Greek texts in the original, which is incredibly important. But the significant waves of their texts, think Herodotus or Thucydides, only really began to be translated into Latin and widely circulated in the West much later, often in the 15th century.
Why so late?
It often happened as scholars fled the collapsing empire, especially after the fall of Constantinople, bringing their precious manuscripts with them. It was almost like an untapped reservoir until things got desperate there.
So this explosion of new knowledge from both the Islamic world and eventually Byzantine led to another huge development, the birth of European universities around 1200, Paris, Bologna, Oxford.
Yes, these were genuinely new kinds of institutions, and they laid the groundwork for modern academia. They developed elements we'd recognize today: formal exams, degrees, faculties.
Even grading.
Well, systems of assessment, certainly.
Okay.
And the curriculum itself shifted dramatically, becoming heavily Aristotle-centric. Plus, Latin is that universal scholarly language. It meant students and scholars could travel from Ireland to Poland down to Spain and engage in learned discourse. It created a true international intellectual community.
Amazing. So what's crucial for you, the listener, to understand is that the Middle Ages really wasn't the static, ignorant era. Not at all.
Not at all. It was a time of dynamic knowledge acquisition, institutional innovation, and really complex intellectual debates that shaped the very foundation of Western thought and education.
We're still living with its legacy, really.
Absolutely. In our universities, our ways of thinking.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about power. What did it actually mean to be a king in the Middle Ages? We often think of these grand, absolute monarchs, maybe, but the reality was more nuanced.
Definitely more nuanced. Kingship was primarily hereditary, first off.
Yeah.
Based on bloodline rather than, say, election.
Right, born into it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And while the idea of divine right as a fully formed theory comes later, the notion that kingship was divinely appointed certainly existed. Kings were seen as the Lord's anointed, especially through coronation rituals.
Where they made promises.
Exactly. Promises to maintain peace, suppress crime, rule justly. Came with the responsibilities, at least in theory.
So it wasn't just raw power, but these theories of kingship varied quite a bit, didn't they? I mean, from divinely sanctioned figures to, well, what was the other end of them?
You had some radical clerics who basically viewed kings as little more than robbers on a grand scale. So, yeah, a wide range of views.
And were there ideal models they...
Oh, yes. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 AD, was a huge one. If you look back to Rome, initiating the Holy Roman Empire, a really unique form of medieval kingship that amazingly lasted over 1,000 years in various forms.
Wow. And biblical kings.
Biblical kings like Solomon definitely served as models of wisdom and justice. But, practical politics often trump these ideas. Look at Richard II of England. He had a perhaps inflated view of his own royal authority.
And that didn't end well for him.
No, it led directly to his deprecation.
So even with hereditary claims and divine backing, kings still needed support, right? They couldn't just do whatever they wanted. They needed the aristocracy, baron, church leader.
Oh, absolutely essential. Their approval wasn't just, a nice to have. It often manifested in actual written agreement.
Like contracts.
Sort of. In Scandinavian kingdoms, for instance, kings explicitly made agreements with their aristocracy about how they would rule, acceptable levels of taxation, things like that.
And the most famous example, of course.
Has to be Magna Carta.
Yeah.
1250.
Right. Which wasn't immediately successful.
No, it was initially invalidated by the Pope, but it was reissued multiple times. And it became this prominent reference point for limiting royal power, especially around taxation, without consent. It showed that even powerful kings couldn't rule entirely arbitrarily. They needed some form of consent, at least from the powerful players.
And speaking of England, the Norman conquest in 1066 brought a pretty dramatic change to the power structure there, didn't it?
Huge change. Very swift. The theory developed that the king was the ultimate owner of all land in England. Everyone else, nobles included, held land from him.
A hierarchy based on land tenure.
Exactly. And this was all extensively documented in the Domesday Book, that incredible survey commissioned by William the Conqueror, a massive consolidation of information and therefore power.
And kings weren't just sitting in palaces, were they? They had to be seen.
Not at all. Many kings were constantly itinerant. Traveling their kingdoms was essential to assert authority, resolve local disputes, collect dues, show the flag, basically.
Making their power real on the ground.
Precisely. You see this with the early Capetian kings of France. Initially, their actual power was pretty limited, confined mostly to the area around Paris and Orléans.
Just a small region, really.
Very small. It wasn't until the early 13th century, under Philip Augustus, that the French monarchy dramatically expanded its direct rule, laying the foundations for a more unified French state.
So was this the birth of the nation-state as we kind of think of it now?
Well, that term nation-state is tricky, and historians debate its applicability to the medieval period. You certainly had strong national identities, think Scots versus English, often quite hostile views of the other, but many kingdoms were ethnically mixed. What we see more clearly is the consolidation of state power, the machinery of government becoming stronger, more centralized, particularly in places like France and England.
This next point, though, it highlights a really significant shift and quite a dark. As states consolidated, a more radical, often intolerant Christian ideology emerged.
Unfortunately, yes. This period saw the systematic persecution and expulsion of groups deemed other. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, Spain in 1492. Muslims were also forced out of Spain after the Reconquista.
Driven by what? A demand for uniformity?
Largely, yes. A redefinition of belonging that increasingly demanded a Christian identity. And the church itself developed what's been called the machinery of persecution, the Inquisition.
Right. Famous or...
Treating heresy, so dissenting Christian beliefs, as the enemy within. This led to things like the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal military campaign against a Christian group in southern France. It's a period some historians call the birth of a persecuting society.
It's a stark reminder of the complexity. But despite these darker aspects, many modern institutions we rely on still have deep medieval roots, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Think about systems of government. Parliament in England, the exchequer for finance, developing legal systems, common law, even legally constituted towns and cities with their own charters and self-government to a degree.
And there were other models besides kingship, too.
Definitely. Look at the Italian city-states, Venice, Florence, Genoa. They emerged as powerful self-governing republics, developing complex bureaucratic and administrative systems, even while technically part of the Holy Roman Empire. And Iceland even existed for a long time as a kind of commonwealth without a king at all.
So lots of experimentation. And buildings played a big role, too, didn't they, as symbols of this power?
Very much so. Westminster in England, the Ile de la Cité in Paris, those towering palaces and town halls in the Italian city-state, they were just functional. They were physical representations, instruments of governance, designed to impress and project authority.
So what's really fascinating here is how these medieval power structures, from the divine right of kings to citizen-led republic, laid the groundwork for the modern state.
Exactly. And it illustrates this constant tension between centralized authority and the need for consent, or at least acceptance, from the government. A tension we are definitely still navigating today.
Okay, let's move to our final area, which is perhaps the most personal and maybe the hardest grasp, from the sexual desire. This feels like a really challenging topic.
It's exceptionally difficult, yeah. Partly because it's so private, but also because their whole framework for thinking about it was so different from ours. Our insights come primarily from two main and often conflicting sources.
Which are?
Well, first, you have prescriptive church doctrine. What the church, the most powerful institution, said should be the case regarding sex and relationships.
The official rule.
The official rules, exactly. And second, you have imaginative literature, poetry, which offers glimpses into maybe what was felt, or at least imagined, outside those strict rules. Neither gives us a perfect window, obviously.
Right. And the church itself, its leaders, the clergy, were increasingly required to be celibate, especially from the 11th century onward. How did that shape the general view of sex?
Well, it reinforced a certain suspicion of sexuality. While Christian theology technically held that sex was part of God's original creation.
Before the fall.
Before the fall, yes. But in the current human world, post-fall, sex became deeply associated with lust, with carnal desire, seen as a consequence of original sin.
So the church's position was pretty strict.
Very strict. The only acceptable form of sex was between a married man and woman, and crucially, only for the purpose of procreation.
It's for having children.
That was the only legitimate reason. Even what they called enthusiastic lovemaking between a husband and wife was considered a venial sin, a minor forgivable offense, but still technically sin. St. Augustine famously stated something like, "Passionate love, even of one's own wife, is adultery."
Wow, that's intense. And the push for clerical celibacy, wasn't that also tied up with more practical matters, like church property?
That's a very strong argument historians make, yes. Celibacy helped ensure the church retained control over its vast land holdings and appointments. It prevented church positions and wealth from becoming hereditary, passed down through a priest's family.
Ah, makes sense. Stops dynasties forming within the church.
Exact. And monastic ideals were hugely influential too. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Virginity was incredibly highly prized, especially for women, sometimes publicly celebrated.
And the Virgin Mary was the ultimate model, right? Elevated to hyperdulia.
Absolutely. She represented this incredible theological balancing act, the most revered virgin and the most revered mother. Hyperdulia was that unique, supreme veneration reserved just for her above all other saints.
And some women actively tried to emulate her.
Yes, particularly holy women. Someone like Christina of Markyte in 12th century England. She famously resisted her parents' attempts at an arranged marriage, ran away, and became an anchoress, a religious recluse actively pursuing virginity, even with support from some male clergy against her family's wishes.
So the church wasn't just setting ideals, it was actively policing behavior too, right down to the local level.
Oh, deaf bishops doing their rounds would frequently find priests living with housekeepers, often their long-term partners and mothers of their children. King John of England even threatened to imprison these women during a dispute with the church hierarchy.
And what about ordinary people, the lay?
Church courts investigated fornication, that's sex outside marriage among ordinary folk. Now, while the clergy condemned it as sinful, sometimes severely,
Like calling it heresy.
some theologians, like Albertus Magnus, did argue it was akin to heresy. But many ordinary lay people probably didn't see it as quite that great. Punishments often involved public humiliation, being whipped through the streets, maybe half naked, or fines. Adultery, though, sex involving a married person, was generally seen as more serious.
Why? Because of property.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because of its potential impact on property rights and inheritance. That made it a much bigger deal socially and legally.
But then, contrasting with all this church strictness, around 1100, you get these completely new forms of literature. Courtly love, romance. It sounds like a different world.
It really is a major cultural shift. You have the troubadour poets in southern France producing thousands of poems, often about a man's idealized, intensely emotional, sometimes unrequited service to his lady.
The whole knight serving his lady trope.
That's where it comes from. And then in northern France, you get romance literature named after the vernacular Romance language, not Latin. Think Arthurian tales.
Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde.
Classic example, often featuring passionate, frequently adulterous love. This literature really invents our modern concept of romance love as this overwhelming, driving, almost spiritual force.
And who was supporting this? Where did it come from?
It seems to have been fostered particularly in smaller, decentralized noble court and wealthy female patrons like Marie de Champagne. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, played a really important role in commissioning and encouraging these works. It also got tangled up with ideas of chivalry, the notion that knights fought better when inspired by love for their lady.
A whole different way of thinking about it. And you mentioned another fascinating shift. The church itself started emphasizing consent.
Yes, this is huge. While marriage absolutely remained, for most people, a familial and property alliance, the church, by the late 12th century, increasingly insisted that the consent of the two individuals involved was the sole requirement for a valid marriage.
Wow, that seems incredibly modern, almost a radical departure.
It was a radical departure from centuries of tradition where families decided everything. Now, putting it into practice was another matter, but the principle was established.
So we have women being put on a pedestal in courtly love, but did this actually translate into, real power for them in what was still a very patriarchal society?
That's the complex question. Not necessarily a massive shift in day-to-day power for most women, but there were subtle changes, maybe cracks in the edifice. Between 1100 and 1500, there were about 27 documented female sovereigns ruling in their own right in Western Europe. There had been basically none before that period.
Interesting.
And widows, in particular, could be quite powerful. If their husbands died, they often held significant property and could exercise much more than married women.
And modern scholarship has really dug into this whole area, hasn't it? Women's roles, the history of sexuality, challenging older assumptions.
Well, absolutely, especially around concepts like homosexuality. It's crucial not to impose our modern categories directly onto the past. The medieval church condemned specific sexual acts, often grouped under the term sodomy, which could include various non-procreative acts between men or men and women.
But that's different from an identity.
Very different from our modern concept of homosexuality as an inherent identity or orientation. For example, a king like Edward the Confessor in England, who was childless, was often praised by the church after his death for his supposed chosen virginity, seen as virtuous, rather than being analyzed through a modern lens of sexual orientation. We have to be careful with terminology.
It's so complex. So if we pull back and look at the bigger picture for desire.
What you see in the medieval period is this profound tension between, on the one hand, very strict religious doctrine about sex and sin, and on the other, these burgeoning cultural expressions of passionate love, romance, and desire.
And many aspects of how we think about love, ships, consent, even privacy today, they have surprisingly deep roots in these medieval shifts.
They really do.
Wow. What a journey that was, 1,000 years. We've revealed, I hope, a medieval world that was actively building, preserving, innovating knowledge.
Navigating incredibly complex and, yes, often brutal power dynamics.
And exploring the really multifaceted nature of human desire from, spiritual virginity all the way to passionate courtly love.
Far from being dark or stagnant, the Middle Ages were just incredibly vibrant, full of contradictions, and deeply formative. They laid the foundations for so much of what we experience and understand today.
It's a testament to human complexity, isn't it?
It really is. Innovation, adaptation, belief, conflict, it's all there.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about as you go about your day. Consider how our own contemporary ideas about education, about governance and rights, about personal freedoms, even about romantic relations, how much of that is shaped by these deep medieval roots?
Yeah. What institutions or beliefs do you maybe hold dear that might, in fact, be a direct legacy of this incredible, often misunderstood era?
Something to mull over. A fascinating, sure.